I've always been drawn to abandoned places, relics of the past left to decay. When I heard about an old church from the 1950s on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. Locals said it had been abandoned for decades, a forgotten place of worship shrouded in mystery and tales of strange occurrences. Naturally, I had to see it for myself. It was a crisp autumn evening when I finally decided to go. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows across the countryside as I drove to the site. The church stood alone, surrounded by overgrown weeds and trees that seemed to reach out with skeletal fingers. The structure was surprisingly intact, the weathered stone walls and broken stained glass windows whispering of its former glory. I parked my car a safe distance away and approached the building on foot. Each step I took seemed to echo in the quiet, deserted landscape. The wooden doors were slightly ajar, creaking ominously as I pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, and a chill ran down my spine despite the relatively warm evening. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the fading sunset filtering through the shattered stained glass. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The pews were still arranged in neat rows, though many were broken and rotting. A sense of unease settled over me, but I pressed on, curiosity driving me deeper into the shadowy recesses of the church. As I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing on the stone floor, I noticed the temperature seemed to drop. A cold, unnatural breeze swept through the building, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The altar at the front was draped in tattered cloth, and behind it, a large crucifix hung crookedly on the wall. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I decided to explore the basement, where I'd heard most of the strange occurrences had taken place. The narrow staircase leading down was covered in grime, each step creaking loudly under my weight. At the bottom, the air was even colder, and the smell of damp earth and decay was almost overwhelming. The basement was a labyrinth of small rooms and corridors. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible, but unmistakably real. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of indistinct voices murmuring in the darkness. I shone my flashlight around frantically, but saw nothing. My pulse quickened, fear clawing at my throat. I wanted to leave, but something compelled me to move forward, deeper into the basement. As I turned a corner, I saw a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. The whispering seemed to be coming from behind it. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered with old furniture and debris. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, and sitting in it was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin a sickly gray and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow sockets, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. It had long, clawed fingers that rested on the arms of the chair, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. The whispering stopped abruptly as the creature turned its head to look at me, its empty eyes locking onto mine. I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me, paralyzing me in place. The demon rose from the chair, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It seemed to glide across the floor, coming closer and closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from those horrifying eyes. The creature stopped just inches from me, its foul breath washing over my face. It reached out one long, clawed hand and brushed it against my cheek, the touch icy and painful. The grin on its face widened, and it let out a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the room. In that moment, something snapped inside me, and I found the strength to move. I turned and fled, racing back through the labyrinth of corridors, up the creaking staircase, and out of the church. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my heart pounding and my breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The image of the demon's twisted grin and hollow eyes was burned into my mind, haunting me even now. I don't know what I encountered in that old church, but I do know one thing. I will never, ever go back. Exploring abandoned buildings had always been our thrill. We heard about an old, deserted church on the outskirts of town, rumored to be haunted. Naturally, we had to check it out. It was a chilly autumn evening when we arrived, the sun setting and casting eerie shadows across the dilapidated structure. The church loomed before us, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The stained glass windows, long shattered, were gaping holes that seemed to beckon us inside. We pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the creaking sound echoing through the empty nave. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew clung to everything. Our flashlights flickered as we moved deeper into the darkness, the light casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. At first, it was thrilling, the excitement of exploring the unknown. We laughed nervously, our voices echoing off the walls. But as we ventured further, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. The air grew colder, and the silence became oppressive, as if the very building were holding its breath. We reached the altar, its once magnificent structure now a decaying ruin. Behind it was a door, partially hidden by a tattered curtain. With a shared glance, we decided to see what lay beyond. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The basement. As we descended, the temperature dropped even further, and an inexplicable sense of dread washed over us. The basement was vast, with rows of old wooden pews and dusty relics strewn about. In the center of the room was a large, ornate cross lying broken on the ground. Suddenly, one of our friends let out a strangled cry. We turned to see him staring at a wall, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. We shone our flashlights where he was looking, and there, etched into the stone, were strange symbols. They pulsed with a faint, malevolent glow. A cold wind whipped through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. Panic set in as we fumbled in the darkness, trying to get them back on. When they flickered to life again, we saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the light, watching us with glowing red eyes. Our hearts pounded in unison as we backed away, but the figure moved closer, its form becoming more distinct. It was a twisted, grotesque mockery of a human, with elongated limbs and a face contorted in a permanent snarl. It hissed, a sound that sent chills down our spines, and the room seemed to close in around us. Desperation took over. We scrambled up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The door at the top slammed shut, trapping us. We pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder and the hissing grew louder, as if the demon were right behind us. We turned to face it, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. It was there, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. It reached out a clawed hand, and a wave of icy fear washed over us. We could feel its presence, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to sap our very will to fight. Just when we thought all hope was lost, the door burst open, and we stumbled out into the nave. We ran for the exit, not daring to look back. As we burst through the doors, the cold night air hit us, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness inside. We didn't stop running until we were far from the church, our lungs burning and our hearts pounding. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, the fear still coursing through our veins. We never spoke of what happened that night, but the memory haunted us. The feeling of being watched, the oppressive darkness, and the burning red eyes. We had encountered something beyond our understanding, something evil that still lurked in that old church, waiting for the next group of foolish explorers. As the summer sun began to set, casting long shadows over the small town, I found myself drawn to the old church on the outskirts. It had always fascinated me. The Gothic architecture, the towering spires, and the centuries-old graveyard surrounding it gave it an eerie allure. I had heard whispers about strange occurrences within its walls, but I dismissed them as mere town legends. That evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and a desire for solitude, I decided to explore the church. The wooden door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a gust of musty air greeted me. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few flickering candles providing light. As I stepped inside, the heavy door slammed shut behind me, echoing through the cavernous space. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed off the unease and ventured further. The pews were arranged neatly, but a thick layer of dust indicated that the church had been abandoned for years. I made my way to the altar, the silence around me almost deafening. As I approached, a sudden chill ran down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt as if I were being watched, but when I turned around, there was nothing but empty pews. I shook off the feeling and continued my exploration. Behind the altar, a narrow staircase led to the bell tower. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to climb it. Each step creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder the higher I went. When I reached the top, I was greeted by a panoramic view of the darkening town. The bell, a massive, ancient structure, loomed above me. I couldn't resist the urge to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, a deafening clang echoed through the tower, and the bell began to swing of its own accord. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the floor beneath me seemed to tremble. Panic set in, and I rushed back down the staircase, my footsteps echoing wildly. As I reached the bottom, I heard a faint, sinister whisper that sent chills down my spine. It was unintelligible but filled with malevolence. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my body felt rooted to the spot. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around me. Desperate to escape, I sprinted towards the exit. But as I reached the door, it refused to budge. I pulled with all my strength, but it remained firmly shut. My breathing grew ragged, and a sense of dread washed over me. I felt an icy hand brush against my shoulder, and I spun around, finding myself face to face with a shadowy figure. The figure's eyes glowed with a sinister light, and its presence exuded pure malice. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with terror. The figure raised a hand, and I felt an invisible force tighten around my throat, choking the air out of me. Summoning every ounce of strength, I managed to break free from its grip and stumbled backward. My vision blurred, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. Just as darkness threatened to consume me, the door burst open, and I tumbled outside, gasping for air. I lay on the cold ground, staring up at the now silent church. The figure was gone, and the whispers had ceased, but the memory of those glowing eyes haunted me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. That night I couldn't sleep, tormented by the events in the church. I never spoke of what happened, and I never returned to that cursed place. The fear lingered, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked within those ancient walls. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something still watches me, waiting for the right moment to strike.